Hello everybody, you're listening to the Polymath radio show with your host, Daniel Aaron Levy. It's lovely to be back doing what I love. I missed last week unfortunately because it was Mother's Day. I don't want to go home for that, but I'm back. Brief reminder of who I am. My name is Daniel Aaron Levy, in case you couldn't tell. I'm a med student at the Uni of Bristol. I'll be taking a year out next year as well to get my master's degree in psychology at the Uni of Liverpool. This show is called Polymath. It's kind of like TED Talks-ish. It's just me talking about stuff that I find interesting for an hour, and I think you guys will find interesting too. But the key thing is that unlike TED Talks, this is colloquial and it's not academic. I'm not a professional and I'm not speaking in an expert capacity. And of course, this is an unscripted show. It always has been, always will be. It's all off the cuff. I've got some bullet point notes here just to guide me and make sure that I don't yap too much, but it's never just written out in advance. Now, today's episode is one that I find really interesting, and that is why are some countries richer and more developed than others? So, enough foreplay, let's get into it. I'm excited. So, obviously with a big complex question like this, there's going to be lots of reasons for it. And a lot of the reasons that are commonly suggested are geography, of course, politics, economics, history, culture, things like that. It'd be very difficult for me to elevate, and be actually really illogical for me to elevate one of these single reasons as just the ultimate cause of development and wealth of a country. But there is an overarching / underlying reason that I think incorporates all these different factors into a unique synthesis. And before I mention that, I'm just going to tease you guys a little bit. Before I actually mention that, I'm just going to go over what it isn't. So there have been many alternative explanations for why are some countries richer, and a lot of these are very flawed. The most common explanation I see is about industrialization. It's like, well, the West industrialized first, so of course they're richer and more developed than other countries industrialized later. And yes, that is correct, but here's the thing. That's approximate cause. Yes, in the 1800s and I guess late 1700s for Britain, the West industrialized and the non-West didn't, causing a massive divergence in wealth. But it begs the question, why did the West industrialize first? It also completely overlooks the fact that in the 1700s, the West had been developing rapidly, as well as in the 1600s as well, and arguably the 1500s too, and it already eclipsed many non-Western countries. It's also very important to keep in mind that after industrialization happened in the West, it was way slower to catch on in other countries than you think it would be. I mean, Japan is the most salient example of a country which didn't industrialize in the early 1800s, and then did so extremely rapidly, adopting modern technology and modern manufacturing methods, etc., etc. But Japan is an exception. Like, that technology was known to the world, but most non-Western countries did not industrialize in time. So clearly, there is something else at play here. It can't just be industrialization. And then you might be thinking, well, let's go back a factor, right? Let's go back to the 1400s, 1500s, colonization. Some parts of the world are more developed, or lesser than others due to colonization. Colonizers arrive at countries, suck all the wealth of them, underdevelop them, and then leave that country as a mess. And this isn't untrue. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa is a perfect example of countries which are all colonial, all sort of former colonies, and then are now greatly underdeveloped. But again, it's not an ultimate cause, it's an approximate cause. Because the question that is begged is, why is it the West that went on to colonize the world? Why not China, who in 1 AD had 25% of the world's GDP? Why was it not India, who in I think 1500 AD had 33% of the world's AD? Why was it not the Islamic world, who in 1000 to 1500 AD was unquestionably more developed, more powerful, more mighty than any European country? Why was it not the countries of West Africa and the various empires there? One of the rulers of Mali, the famous emperor Mansa Musa, had so much wealth that when he went on holiday to other countries, he caused an inflationary crisis there by giving out loads of gold. Why was it not the empire of Ethiopia? Why was it not the empires of the New World? I mean, you had massive populous empires there, the Incas, the Mayans, the Aztecs. You can argue for those cases that the lack of writing, iron, and horses could hamper development and colonization ability. But I mean, shipbuilding and navigation was still possible. And those countries could still have at least explored more of their home continents, and yet it didn't happen. So clearly, colonization is not the only answer. Another really important thing to mention is that colonization does not necessarily develop the colonizing country. Spain is a perfect example of this. So Spain finds the New World. They gain mountains of gold, mountains of silver, literally. There's a mountain in Potosi, which was, I think it was like Cheddar. Damn it, let me look it up. It's like I'm just going to look up Potosi Mountain of Silver. It was a mountain literally made almost entirely of silver, which was just cleared of silver by the Spaniard. Cerro Rico. That's Cerrorico. It's just Spanish for rich mountain. And it's a mountain in the Andes, and it was basically all silver. And you had fleets, flotillas of ships going from the New World to the Old World, bringing gold and silver. And yet, that happened in like the early 1500s, right? Is when it really got underway. But only 150 years later, in the late 1600s, Spain was already becoming pretty backwards compared to the other countries. No, not the 1600s. Well, I guess the early signs were in the 1600s, but let's not be too hasty. In the early 1700s, Spain was already becoming backwards compared to the other powers of Europe. It's clear that that influx of gold and silver was not sufficient to develop the country. What that wealth didn't go into national development. It went to the pockets of the elite in Spanish society, who pissed it away on conspicuous consumption, living lives of luxury, and of course commodities such as sort of developing sugar plantations, rum plantations, tobacco plantations, etc., and of course on war. All of these things may bring benefits or profits in the short term, but they're not laying the foundations of long-lasting development. What they're really doing is tying that economy and that society to commodities coming out of the New World, of which there is a limited supply, of which the price of which were kind of fetched by markets is subject to great fluctuations. This is exactly what happened, by the way. Spain found a ton of silver, initially got really rich, and then found its returns diminishing consistently because it was just flooding European markets with silver. It's a commodity-based economy. It was a commodity-based economy. Commodity just being a physical thing that you would sell, like some sort of good. In this case, a luxury good. And that money didn't go into manufacturing or finance or banking or anything that produces long-lasting development. So, colonization, not the ultimate cause. Another ultimate cause, which is sometimes quoted for development, is natural resources. But this isn't true at all. In fact, history shows us that it's almost kind of the opposite. I mean, Germany and Japan, famously, like some of the most developed countries in the world, and I think second and third in terms of GDP, not GDP by PPP. Sorry, purchasing power parity, because then it's China, USA, and then Germany. But Germany and Japan famously didn't have that many natural resources. Germany had coal in the early days of industrialization coming from the Ruhr, of course, but it didn't have much oil and it didn't have much rubber, which hampered its performance in World War II. Japan famously had few natural resources. It was the pursuit of oil was one of the reasons why they conquered a bunch of East Asia and created that East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which was their economic union designed to supply them with raw materials. Meanwhile, the most richly blessed country in terms of natural resources are countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is massively blessed with cobalt and lithium and lots of other precious commodities, and yet is greatly underdeveloped. And you see this pattern recurring quite a lot. I mean, the USA is an exception because it's a developed country and it's quite wealthy in natural resources. That's really because it's massive. And due to the circumstances of colonization, the USA was able to acquire much more land and natural resources than it otherwise would have been able to. In fact, there is a concept referred to by experts as the resource curse, which is basically how if a country is really well endowed with natural resources, it tends to become underdeveloped and less developed over time, rather than more developed. A subcategory of this is called the oil curse, which kind of refers to how some countries like Angola, Nigeria, etc., discover oil and then become less developed. So clearly, natural resources isn't the key here. By the way, there is a reason why that resource curse and oil curse is a thing. We're going to get onto it in a moment. Don't worry. But there is a reason for it. And then the final explanation I've often heard, which has been advanced in terms of development, is religion. The first time I heard this argument was when I was in school and some guy said, oh yeah, Christianity is causing Africa to be underdeveloped, which is obviously a little bit silly. But maybe a more articulate, a more intelligent version of the religion hypothesis would be the one proposed by Max Weber, the famous sociologist who famously suggested, or postulated, one might say, that Protestantism was a major cause of industrialization development because the ethics and the kind of behaviors that Protestantism inspires are saving money, being thrifty, working hard, and it lends itself well to merchant affairs and capitalism and working for wages and making money, etc., But I also think these explanations are very flawed. First of all, it's just very, very simple. I understand why Max Weber made that explanation, because actually, if you take a look at a map of the 1800s, and you look at Protestant Europe, which is like Northern Europe, the UK, the Low Countries, sorry, that's like the Benelux region, Germany, Scandinavia, and then you look at a map of development and industrial progress. Yes, Protestantism and development correlate really, really well. But again, it's a correlation. It's not necessarily a causation. I mean, to me, it just doesn't really make inherent sense that something like Protestantism could cause development, especially because that's only looking at a very specific case, sort of industrializing Europe and not development in the long term. So it's just a little bit silly. It could be that there is some underlying factor. So underlying socioeconomic and political factors both prove that these countries were fertile grounds for both Protestantism and then later capitalism and industrialism. That I think is more likely. It's also very likely that early capitalism and mercantilism and the growth of trade and finance in the 1500s and the 1600s what was I saying? Oh yeah, it's possible that the kind of growth of trade, especially in countries like the Hanseatic League, sorry, I'm getting all muddled here. Let me start again. It's also possible that it's the other way around. So for example, in the 1300s, you have a really thriving manufacturing trade in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries. You also have lots of trade going on in northern Germany, where a bunch of countries in northern Germany, collectively known as the Hanseatic League, engaged in large amounts of trading. And it's possible that that and the subsequent development that entailed then proved a more fertile ground for Protestantism to take hold in later centuries. It's also possible that, yes, the values of thrift and diligence and material hard work fostered by Protestantism did play a hand in development of industrialization and capitalism. It's likely to be a little bit of all of these factors, but I don't think this is enough to explain development. I also don't think something like cultural factors are enough to explain development and countries growing richer over the centuries anyway. I think it's much more likely that the culture of various countries arises from the socioeconomic and political order of those countries. And by the way, that's not a rogue opinion. I think the bulk of anthropologists would agree with me. I mean, so two of my favorite anthropologists are Jared Diamond, who you guys may have heard of. He's the author of a book, Guns, Germs and Steel, and Marvin Harris, who you probably haven't heard of. But the argument that these guys propose in their books, a very convincing effect, is that culture and the cultural practices adopted by people are a result, specifically are an adaptation to the circumstances, both environmental and societal, that these peoples find themselves in at the time. I'd really recommend reading Guns, Germs and Steel, and also Marvin Harris's great book, Cannibals and Kings. Both Diamond and Harris have written other anthropology books that I would recommend, but I'm just going to start with those for now. But all this begs the question, which I've been withholding for you guys for 13 minutes now, which is very, very devious of me. But all this begs the question, what is the overlying reason behind development? And I'm going to tell you, institutions. Institutions is, I think, the great underlying reason behind development, because it encompasses lots of different sort of separate factors and weaves them into a coherent synthesis. What do I mean by institutions? What is an institution? An institution sort of just refers to like a pillar in how society is constructed. So the law is an institution. The police is an institution. Education and universities and schooling is an institution. The military is an institution. The functionings of the government are an institution. The laws on monopolies and private property are institutions. An institution is just a broad term of explaining how is a society built. What is the socioeconomic and political order of that society? And in this kind of episode, I'm going to divide institutions in four ways. So institutions can be economic or political. Political institutions are all about how power works in a society. So for example, is it a dictatorship? Is it a democracy? Is it an oligarchy? Is it something in between? Is it a military dictatorship? A civilian dictatorship? How does this work? Is there a parliament? Is there some sort of council? Some sort of senate? Is there any separation between military and civilian rule? Is there any separation between the executive and the legislature and the judiciary? How is political power structured, and who has it, and what are their constraints on exercising it? And then there are economic institutions, which is how does the economy work? So for example, is private property a thing? Are people allowed to own their own things? Are they allowed to start their own business? If so, who is allowed to do that? Are there financial institutions? Can you get loans? Can you get credit? Is it possible to form a monopoly? Are there such things as banks? Is there a merchant class which is protected by law? Can a monarch just take away someone's property completely arbitrarily and for no reason? Can people invest in ventures? Are commoners bound to their land, as in serfs, being unable to leave their land, or are they able to go elsewhere? Do civilians have the right to conduct commerce? Etc., etc. It's just, how is these societies structured? How does it work at the roots? And either an economic or political institution can be one of two types. They can be inclusive or they can be exclusive. Another way of talking about this is pluralistic or extractive, i.e., are these institutions exclusive or extractive? So, i.e., are they designed to benefit a narrow elite at the expense of everyone else and the country's development? Or are a country's institutions inclusive, aka pluralistic? So this is to say, are these countries' institutions designed to facilitate development and allow everyone in society to benefit? Now, these terms didn't just come straight out of my head. They do actually have precedent. And I've read quite a few books on international development, but the flagship one that I cannot recommend enough, is a book called Why Nations Fail. It is a great book, which makes the same argument about institutions with, of course, detailed explanation and lots of examples. I'm actually just going to look up the authors of that book, because it's a fantastic book and I'd really recommend it. I want to start recommending more books to you guys in these episodes, because a lot of my knowledge comes from these kind of books that I should be talking about and that I am referencing in these podcasts. So, it's a book by the economist Dan Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. Great book, fantastic book. Of all the books I've read about development and economic history, that I think is the best. But anyway, now, most societies throughout history have consisted of extractive, aka exclusive institutions. And this is because most societies in the majority of human history have consisted of a period of people. At the very top of that pyramid is a narrow elite who just oppresses and exploits the hell out of everyone else. And that is how the vast majority of societies have been structured. There was a change away from that originating in the early modern era, and only in some countries, mainly in Europe. So the early modern era is a period of history defined as 1453 to 1789. 1453 was the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. 1789 was the French Revolution, a very important year and one that we are going to be talking about in future podcasts. The late modern era, by contrast, is 1789 to right now. And when it comes to the early modern era is when much of the developed world now, i.e. Western Europe, started to diverge in subtle ways from the rest of the world in terms of development. Now, this kind of slow, very gradual divergence is referred to as the Great Divergence. And if you Google search the Great Divergence, let me just do that now, just so I can check that I'm not talking out my arse. Yes, the first result you get is a Wikipedia page basically saying the Great Divergence is the socio-economic shift in which the Western world overcame pre-modern growth constraints and emerged during the 19th century as the most powerful and wealthy world civilizations. Now, it says the 19th century because the 19th century is when most of that divergence happened, but the roots of that emergence came in the early modern era. And that's because the socio-political order of these countries gradually began to shift. And wedged in between that narrow elite of people wedged between the social stratum of the elite who could do whatever they like and the social stratum of the oppressed masses, they gradually began to form a mercantile class engaged in trade and commerce. And this occurred in Western Europe. And in the 1800s, you see a middle class, a definite, quite sizable middle class developing for one of the first times in history. But before that period, before really the 1800s, the early modern era was just sort of the predecessor of that. It was the precursor of it. It's not really when you had a sizable middle class. Before that era, most of human history has been sort of a narrow elite exploiting everyone else. And this narrow elite, essentially, because they have a monopoly on force, they can oppress the other masses using military force. They create political institutions that benefit them. So democracies were incredibly rare before industrialized society became a thing, because what was I saying? Oh yeah, democracies were incredibly rare because if you have a narrow elite at the top, they're not going to willingly cede their power to the masses. They're going to establish political institutions that benefit them, the elite, at the expense of everyone else. Even in the American Constitution, has been described by, I forget his name, but it's someone who Chomsky cites quite often. It's been described as a founder's coup, i.e. the founding fathers didn't actually want to create a full democracy. They saw the kind of great masses as not intelligent, not enlightened enough to share in the governance of their country. They essentially wanted to create a large oligarchy of just educated, propertied, middle-class men. And indeed, for most of the 1800s, for all of the 1800s, the democracies that formed in the West weren't real democracies. They were democracies where the middle class was given political power. It took until the 20th century for the working class to gain political power. But anyway, so you have a narrow elite which ultimately sustains their eliteness through military force. 2 episodes ago, we actually talked about how the first states formed and how kind of military force and coercion was key for the first elites to form. So these elites create political institutions that benefit them at the expense of everyone else. And because they hold the reins of political power, they're going to create economic institutions that benefit them at the expense of everyone else. So for example, they're going to create economic institutions that, say, force commoners to work on their land, prevent commoners from gaining too much wealth or starting private enterprise or anything like that, forcing commoners to stay in the same place for their whole life, to keep working the land for their whole life. They're going to create institutions which prevent like a merchant class from gaining too much power and being able to institute fair economic laws. They're going to create institutions that allow monopolies to form. And this is exactly what happened. And all of these economic institutions preclude development. So the way that countries essentially got richer up until a few hundred years ago was just by annexing more land and just taking land from others. Because if there's no manufacturing sector of the economy and you have economic institutions which don't allow that kind of stuff to develop, the only way to enrich that country is to gain more land. And international politics becomes a zero-sum game of great aggression. And by the way, in all these societies, there was still lots of wealth circulating. I mean, it would be silly to suggest that the great empires of China and India and Rome, etc., were poor. They were not poor. It's just that the average person in those societies was poor and living basically at a subsistence level. It was only the elites that lived lives of great luxury. And that's because all the wealth in that country wasn't going towards national development. It was going towards lining the pockets of those own elites and giving them luxury and giving them social status and giving them political power. And the elites were able to do that because the institutions of the societies that they live in were structured literally just to benefit them at the expense of everyone else. And by the way, this is why the resource curse exists. Because if you have a country which is blessed with abundant national resources, what happens is if a group is able to seize control of that resource, they gain loads of power. So they create political and economic institutions which benefit them at the expense of the rest of the country. And as a result, the country as a whole doesn't develop. A great example of this is Argentina. In the 1890s, Argentina was like the 6th richest country in the world by GDP per capita. 100 years later, it's far from that because Argentina was a commodity-based economy sustained by beef and guano, and its profits didn't go into long-term development. They didn't go into the manufacturing sector. They didn't go into building infrastructure or factories. They went into developing the facilities for that specific commodity, so building branches, and they went into the pockets of the elites, which means that country as a whole failed to develop. And the resource curse, it's a very well documented problem because of this. It ultimately ties to how an abundance of national resources that can be monopolized by a certain group can be used to shape a country's institutions to stymie that country's development in the long term. And oil is a really good example of this. So you often see this with modern petrostates. So a petrostate is a state which derives most all of its wealth from oil. So I'm just going to take a drink. Give me a moment. I always lose a lot of water in these episodes because it's so hot in this studio. It's right outside the pool. I'm wearing like a tank and a shorts. I've got 2 fans on me. I'm still sweating. It is absolutely ruinous in the studio right now. But I love being here anyway. But anyway, so oil, petrostates. In all of these countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., now their GDP per capita is high. That's not because the average person is living large. It's because there's a narrow elite which is becoming massively wealthy of the profits of the oil. But they're not investing that into developing the country. They're just using that money to benefit themselves. So, for example, in the UAE, for example, 15% of the country are citizens. The other 85% are just migrant workers. The UAE is a great example of a state where there is an elite, albeit quite a broad elite. 15% is very broad for an elite, but still, it's still an elite minority who is just benefiting off the back of the wealth of this country and off the back of the great masses who are exploited in developing that wealth. But there's no future in that. The country itself is not being developed as a whole. And you have so much poverty and inequality in the Gulf states, in the various petro-states of the Middle East and also in Africa because of that exact process happening. Contrast that to a situation like Norway, which does have really, really good political and economic institutions. When there's oil found there, when oil was found in Norway, there was no group or elite who was able to just monopolize control of that oil and just get filthy rich in the process. No, the wealth of that went into the Norwegian public fund. It's amazing. It's such an excellent example of what good institutions can do with natural resources. But you need to have the good institutions need to come first. The Norwegian public fund's amazing. Yeah. It's a great sort of development. You go into Norway. You're a tourist. You fly into Norway. The government gives you like a free hand job when you land. It's amazing. It's all paid for. No, I'm just joking. Being a little bit foolish. But anyway, like, it's just such a massive contrast. It really is just crazy to me. And then, what was I going to say? Oh yeah. And then the West, not just the West, but the West is one of the regions which is now dominant because it was the first region to develop those kind of inclusive political and economic institutions. Now, I'm going to use England as an example here because, first of all, this is such a broad subject. I can only really talk about a little bit of it at the time. I can't talk about every single developed country right now. I'm going to use England because it's a quintessential example of the West's rise to global dominance. And it's also the country that we live in now, so it's kind of relevant to us. So using England as an example, what really happened in England was that in the upcoming to the 1700s, you had gradual changes in political and economic institutions, which slowly morphed from extractive to pluralistic, or exclusive to inclusive. First, you have the development of Parliament, which kind of just created slightly less exclusive political institutions. They're still pretty exclusive, being the monarch and the aristocracy, but still, it's a start. Then you have a kind of spurt of merchant activity in the 1300s as English merchants get wealthier and wealthier, selling wool to Flemish kind of cotton merchants and Dutch cotton merchants. You also have this kind of culture of, in the 1500s and 1600s, there was this kind of gradual development of financial institutions, particularly in the 1600s. The 1600s was quite big for that. A development of the banking system, a greater development of commerce and trade and empowerment of the merchant classes. And all the while you had Parliament constraining the monarch's power to prevent the monarch from just arbitrarily making economic institutions extractive again. Then you have the Glorious Revolution, which was in 1689, I do believe. 1688. Damn, I thought so. You have the Glorious Revolution of 1688. You have the English Civil War, and I think the 1640s. And these events are significant because it basically reduced the power of the monarch and shared it with a broader stratum of people. And if there's a broader stratum of people who are in political power, they're going to create economic institutions which benefit a broader stratum of people as well. Because obviously, whoever's in power is going to create institutions that benefits them. But if there's lots of different groups in power and they're all competing for power, then they're much more likely to create institutions which gives all of them a fair chance to compete. And they're going to create institutions which benefit a greater number of sectors of society. So you have that exact process in England. And then, of course, you have in the 1800s, starting from the late 1700s, industrialization. And then, of course, industrialization was a massive key to modern development. And then later in the 1800s, you had what's known as the productivity revolution. And what happened in the late 1800s in the productivity revolution is basically when the average worker became much more productive due to increases in human capital, i.e. education, and each person being able to be more skilled and do more things. And of course, technological ability. And of course, investments in basic stuff like infrastructure and factories. And in the productivity revolution, basically each worker became more productive. So in a competitive market, employers could afford to pay each worker more and more and more. And then standard of living began to shoot up in the Western world in the late 1800s. This, interestingly, by the way, Karl Marx predicted that communism would first erupt in Western Europe, in the most developed industrialized countries. He predicted that it would happen in Germany. In fact, the communist revolution occurred in Russia because the standard of living rise that had been engendered by the productivity revolution hadn't been as pronounced there, and therefore it wasn't as developed, and people weren't doing as well for themselves, and therefore they were more receptive to extreme ideologies like communism, and therefore there was also less of a middle class. And this is really a whole tangent, but just to mention as a real thing real quick, the presence of a middle class I'm not going to evince a reason because I don't want to talk about things which I'm not fully educated about, but the presence of a middle class has been one of the most important factors in having a successful revolution. So the French Revolution, for example, French Revolution happened, there was a period of terror, but France was very developed in the 1800s and grew on to be more developed. In the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks took power, and, well, as I will talk about in future episodes, the Bolsheviks did not do a great job for the country. But again, that's really for another episode, and don't worry, we will get on that. What was I going to say? Oh yes, so this now begs the question, why did the UK industrialise first? And here's the thing, if you take a bunch of countries in the late 1700s and you compare them all by what the average wage was for the average commoner, you can see that the UK was the highest. So if you're a commoner in the world of the late 1700s, you would want to live in the UK. Because it was in the UK that labour was most expensive, i.e. that you, as a commoner of the working class, although the idea of the working class wasn't really a thing before the Industrial Revolution, but whatever, if you were a commoner, you would want to live in the UK because you'd be getting paid the most. So the UK in the late 1700s is quite an important case because labour, relative to other countries, was very expensive, but capital was quite abundant. There was a really advanced banking and financial system. So if you wanted to start a factory or invest in some new machinery, you could get loans, you could get credit and things like that. So also the UK was a rich country in the 1700s due to non-institutional factors in part. So for example, extensive trade, empire, the simple luck of being on an island and therefore being more insulated from the destruction of war, etc., etc. But the point I'm trying to say is that the UK industrialised first, not because of wishy-washy reasons like Protestantism, as Max Weber stated, or even something like the immediate culture of the UK at the time. It was for more firm underlying economic reasons, i.e. the relationship between labour and capital. So this is why other countries in the past, who had been vastly more wealthy than England, for example, as I mentioned, China and India, the Mughal Empire, at different points controlled 25% of the world's GDP. The reason why they didn't invest in machines and factories and railroads and new technology, etc., was because they didn't need to. Was because labour was so cheap. It was so easy to just have commoners work for you that there was no economic incentive to do that kind of thing. So, for example, in the 2nd century AD, a steam engine was actually invented in the Roman Empire, but it didn't catch on because labour was so cheap. No one would thought to themselves, oh, I know, I'm going to invest a ton of money in getting this new machinery. I'm going to invest a ton of my capital in getting new machinery. Because why would they do that? Labour is so cheap. This is why slavery, by the way, despite being morally utterly detestable, is also really bad for a country's economic development. Because labour is so cheap, there's no real incentive for people to invest in machinery and technology and manufacturing and all the kind of good stuff that leads to real development. You can see this in the example of the American Civil War. So, for example, in the 1820s, the issue of slavery first reared its head in American history, particularly with the issue of the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri was to be admitted into the Union, and the American ruling class was like, oh, should they be a slave state? Should they be a free state? If a civil war happened in the 1820s, the North and the South would have been pretty well balanced. However, in the mid-1800s, the North of the USA started to industrialize, with the result being that by the time the Civil War came around, the North had 3 times the economy of the South. It had 9 times the Navy. It just had it had something like 3 times the free population. It just had these untold economic and demographic advantages because the North had been developing that time, whereas the South hadn't been developing. Because here's the thing, the North at that time was a manufacturing economy. They were making stuff. This international development studies have shown that this is the most reliable path to development, whereas the South of the USA, was a commodity economy. They were making their money off of one thing in particular, cotton. And the thing with cotton is that it encourages a society of extractive institutions. It also doesn't encourage manufacturing or industrial development. It's also not a good idea because the price of the commodity just fluctuates naturally with global conditions. So you're even more vulnerable to the vagaries of globalization than if you were a manufacturing economy. And what often happened actually was in the 1800s, you'd have manufacturing superpowers like the UK creating informal empires. So the British Empire embraced like 25% of the world's landmass. But there was also a concept called the informal British Empire, which just refers to how, due to economic reasons, Britain effectively controlled lots of other regions of the world, including Latin America, because Latin America consisted of commodity economies and they were dependent on their manufactured goods on Britain. So basically they needed Britain more than Britain needed them. So that gave Britain power in that relationship. Similarly, in the USA, the South was a commodity economy and it was dependent on powers like Britain and France to buy their cotton in order to keep them wealthy. So in the Civil War, when the South, by the way, the Civil War in America was 1861 to 1865. So in the Civil War, when the South prevented any exports of cotton to try and force Britain and France to recognize them as countries, it was actually really bad for them because it deprived them of a really important source of revenue and manufactured goods. And Britain and France were just able to get their cotton from other products. So what I'm trying to say is that a key for development is manufacturing and not having your economy being dependent on commodities. So now I want to talk about the contrast between the white British colonies and the Spanish colonies and their kind of institutions. What do I mean by the white British colonies? I'm talking about the USA, I'm talking about Canada, I'm talking about Australia, and I'm talking about New Zealand. South Africa is, I wouldn't call it a white colony because it's much more ethnically diverse than the aforementioned countries that I just mentioned, so I'm going to leave out of that list. But if you look at the USA, for example, you see, conventional wisdom would have it that colonization is what leaves countries underdeveloped. And yes, colonization in almost all cases does leave countries severely underdeveloped. But there is this interesting exception of the USA and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, which have become more wealthy than the UK in the case of the USA and more developed than the UK, arguably in the case of Canada and New Zealand, and I guess Australia as well. So clearly, there has to be something more to it than just the answer, colonialism. And the answer, of course, is institutions. Why is that the case? Okay, so Spain and Portugal got to the New World first. And when they got to the New World, they basically took the most profitable regions. They took the regions which were already inhabited by lots of Native Americans that they could use as a workforce, and it was filled with natural resources like gold, silver, etc., that they could make money from. So the Spaniards and the Portuguese rock up to the places, to their colonies in the New World. They basically destroy a bunch of wealthy empires. They take over the lands, and they immediately create a society with a narrow elite at the top, a narrow colonial elite, who just exploits and oppresses the hell out of the Native Americans there, and establishes a commodity economy based on the abundant natural resources found in those regions. Whereas England, and also France, came to the New World much later. And by that point, the best land was already taken. So England pulls up to the east coast of the modern USA, so the east coast of North America. There's no Native Americans there in sufficient population densities for British colonial masters to exploit. So, fine. The colonial elite of Britain, or the elite of Britain, basically just says, alright, fine, we'll get a bunch of British workers out into North America and we'll exploit the hell out of them. And if you look at colonial laws, English colonial laws in the 1600s, they are draconian. It was very clear that what British authorities were trying to do was to create an oppressed, exploitable mass in North America. But it didn't work. Because unlike in Mesoamerica and Middle America and the kind of regions where Spain and Portugal colonized, England didn't get the best land. It got the kind of marginal land that didn't have much population density. So whenever colonial authorities tried to exploit English people who had migrated there, The English people just went away. They just went west. So the British elite was then like, damn, if we want to get people to work in our colonies in North America, we actually have to incentivize them. And then you get the political and economic institutions that lead to the sort of democracy, not quite modern democracy as we know it, but the USA, the 13 colonies, was one of the most democratic regions at the time and enjoyed a government policy of statutory neglect, where the British government basically said, okay, we won't interfere in your affairs. And the 13 colonies also had really sound economic institutions, which fostered trade and commerce and manufacturing and allowed people to work hard to make profit. Whereas in the Spanish colonies or the Portuguese colonies, if you were some Native American who had been forced to work in the mines, and by the way, labor conscription has been a really massive thing throughout history. It's often known by the French word corvée, but it's occurred in societies for thousands of years now. In fact, really since societies began. So in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, you had labor corvées. You'd be like a Native American. You'd be forced to work in the mines. You would have no opportunities to start your own business or get an apprenticeship or be employed in some kind of commercial manufacturing capacity. No, there's none of that. You'd be forced to live your life day in, day out in these mines, extracting commodities and being exploited by a narrow elite. And the result is that these sound institutions that the British made in lands like Canada, the USA, Australia, and New Zealand led to later development of those societies. But remember, the British did not create those institutions out of the goodness of their own hearts. They created those good institutions because they were forced to create those good institutions. States, as a general rule, elites in society do not do things out of the good of their own hearts. If you allow an elite to have untrammeled political power, history overwhelmingly, undeniably tells us that they will use that power to just exploit everyone else. Now, you see this all the time with modern third world countries and institutions as well. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, when England pulled up to Southern Africa, again, I'm using England as an example, but there are lots of other colonizing powers. When the British pulled up to sub-Saharan Africa, they exploited the absolute shit out of the native people there. They extracted all the resources, and the result is that they created institutions which were designed to benefit a narrow elite at the expense of everyone else. And when the British colonial authorities left, what merely happened was that elite just switched from colonial authorities to whichever native group seized power. And this is why, in a country with weak institutions or exclusive institutions, even if there's some sort of revolution or great change in society, it won't lead to an overarching change, because what will happen is one elite will just get replaced by another elite. You don't have the institutions in place to facilitate the growth of democracy and inclusive institutions. I mentioned the USSR earlier. I'm going to come back to it because this is literally what happened with the Bolshevik Revolution. Tsarist Russia had pretty exclusive institutions. It didn't have a sizable middle class. It didn't have a sizable educated property class. It was getting there, but it wasn't at that stage yet. And what happened in the Russian Revolution is you just have this narrow elite, the Tsars, being replaced by another narrow elite, the Bolshevik Party. All Lenin did was just replace the Tsarist aristocracy with his own elite of the Communist Party. And as a result, the USSR was a miserable place to live in the 20th century, and it didn't develop well in the long term. It is worth noting that in the early economic stages of the USSR, so for example, the 5-year plans, despite there not being inclusive economic institutions, the country still developed very well. And that's because until you reach a point, a committed, uncorrupt central authority who is committed to increasing economic development can just manually move people around and move natural resources around and run the economy as a command economy. That works for a while and to a limited extent, but a central authority can't regulate a vast economy. That also only gets you so far. It also relies on there being a competent and non-corrupt central authority, which is unimaginably rare in history. And that's why the Soviet Union, despite doing well economically in its early stages, began to rapidly fall behind in the 70s and 80s and also the 90s of the USA, because it didn't have the economic institutions needed to secure prosperity. There have been phrase like some say from experts is that there are 3 pillars underlying a developed state, so a developed country: the market, the state, and a community. So there needs to be a strong state who is capable of intervening in the economy. It can't be like a laissez-faire economy. A bit of intervention to rapidly develop an economy is good, as seen in the examples of the East Asian tigers like Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, etc., and also in countries like Germany and in the early stages of the USA as well. Obviously, the USA now is neoliberal, but back in the day, there were quite a few protectionist tariffs. So there needs to be some state intervention in the economy to secure economic development. There also needs to be a market economy. Sadly, running an economy as a command economy, so as one where there's no free market and it's just manually controlled by the government, just doesn't work. And then also, if you want to create a happy society, there has to be some sense of community in that society and have the institutions to foster community. Historically, these community fostering institutions have been religious in nature. In the 20th century, you arguably had like trade unions supporting a feeling of community throughout society. And nowadays, one of the reasons that many experts postulate is behind the coming mental health crisis is that there's no real sense of community in society anymore. I'd argue that a feeling of community isn't really as necessary for economic development as a good balance between market forces and state intervention. The community aspect of it is more just for creating a happy society rather than a developed society. But I hope you see my point. Securing economic development and actually going from an undeveloped to a developed society is really about that balance between market forces and state intervention. And the countries that do so seem to have, I'm trying to think of the word. State capitalism, that's it. So the countries the kind of success stories of development in the 20th century, so Taiwan, South Korea, China, Singapore, etc., have all adopted a form of state capitalism, which is basically when you have market forces and you have market competition. That's really important, the idea of competition in an economy. There's no bailouts or anything like that. But you also have state intervention to foster burgeoning companies and encourage economic development, etc. Laissez-faire and a lack of economic intervention doesn't really work. I mean, free trade and laissez-faire economics worked for Britain in like the late 1700s and early 1800s. That's not because laissez-faire is a sound economic policy. It's because Britain was just the first country to industrialize. So of course they were going to do well. Of course they were going to be extremely wealthy and developed relative to everyone else. Laissez-faire, by the way, is just the economic principle of the government not interfering at all in the economy. Neoliberalism is a laissez-faire economic philosophy, which sort of talks about the same thing. They're not quite the same. That is basically the gist of it. We're going to talk a bit more about political ideologies in future episodes. And we're also going to be talking a bit more in future episodes about what left-wing and right-wing actually mean, what communism actually means, what fascism actually means. But suffice to say, communism has not led to economic development in society. I'm going to do an episode on whether true communism has ever been successful. True communism, by the way, as postulated by Marx, has actually never been tried. I mean, the communist regimes that you saw in the 20th century were complete bastardizations of what Marx wanted. Like, genuinely the complete opposite. Like, Marx was a bit abrasive. I mean, I've read accounts of him in conferences like just being a little bit annoying, but he wasn't a bad person. Like, he cared ultimately about freedom and equality. But the communist regimes that popped up in the 20th century were a complete perversion of the ideas of freedom and equality. And also, the perversion of Marx's ideals in the Soviet Union was so complete that Stalin himself acknowledged that there were classes in the Soviet Union. Stalin himself acknowledged that the Soviet Union consisted of an upper class of intelligentsia, and then different classes of the urban proletariat and then the rural proletariat. Now, I'm not Karl Marx, but I'm thinking if you are a communist country and you acknowledge that you have created social classes, you're not quite doing things right. So what I'm trying to say is true communism has never been tried. I don't think true communism, by the way, as in Marxism, as in what Marx was talking about, I don't think true communism would work if it were tried in practice, but we'll talk about that in a future episode. But communism and having a command economy, so a completely state-controlled economy, and at the other end of the economic spectrum, a completely laissez-faire economy, don't result in economic development. It's a combination of the two. And what else would I like to talk about? Just a brief word on geography as well. Geography, just one of the origin of institutions as well. So I mentioned that natural resources can't be the ultimate cause of development and can ultimately be the opposite, and how institutions are the ultimate cause of development. But the reason, remember what I said at the beginning, where I was like, there were many reasons why some countries are more developed and richer than others, but I feel like the institutional hypothesis is just a good synthesis of all these reasons. What I mean by that is that the institutions that a society developed, yes, are the ultimate underlying cause behind a society's development. But the institutions that a society develops over time are the product of lots of different inputs. For example, the geography of the society, the specific international situation it finds itself in, also, I guess, to some extent, the culture fostered by that society, although I and many anthropologists would argue that the culture of the society is a result of that society's environment. What I'm trying to say is that geography can be quite an important origin of institutions. So I'll give an example. Ancient China in the 1400s was extremely powerful. And there were some, basically, so Christopher Columbus came to the New World with 3 ships, I think. But there was this famous Chinese admiral called Zheng He, who in the 1400s was sponsored by the Chinese Empire to go on a series of vast voyages around Southeast Asia. And he took hundreds of ships with him. Vast ships. Some of the biggest sailing ships the world has ever seen. Ships with up to 9 masts. Ships containing horses, containing water, containing goods, bringing back tribute and plunder and even people from all the various different states around Southeast Asia. Zheng He it is possible, this is one of the favorite alternate history scenarios of historians, Zheng He or some other Chinese explorer sponsored by the New World could potentially have found the New World and could potentially have colonized the New World. But it never happened. Why is that? Because after only, I think, 12 voyages of Zheng He, the Chinese emperor shut him down and basically said, no, I don't want any of that. I don't want you to explore more countries. I don't want you to be going on these large voyages because I don't want to give too much power to the merchant classes in my society. So Chinese society in the 1400s, as most every other society at that time, consisted of a narrow elite exploiting everyone else, and that narrow elite was eager to hold on to power, and it recognized that conducting large trading missions and potentially colonizing new lands could potentially shift the socio-political order of Chinese society and allow a merchant class to come into power. And because Zheng He was denied by the Chinese emperor to go on further voyages, it just never happened. And as a result, China did not discover the New World, and eventually in the 1800s, China was absolutely screwed over by all those countries that did discover the New World. And in contrast, Christopher Columbus in Europe was actually denied by a few monarchs. However, because there were so many different countries in Europe and they were all competing with each other for mastery, he was able to just hop from royal court to royal court until he found a monarch that was willing to sponsor his voyage. And you could argue that geography is the ultimate reason for that. So in China, the geography, it's mostly like flat land dotted with major rivers, like all kind of like major rivers which have historically supported large empires forming around those rivers. And what happens is, what has happened in Chinese history is that you have large empires which have been able to unify all of that land and create a single vast empire. So when an explorer goes up to a monarch, the Chinese monarch, and says, hey, I want to explore and conduct missions, and that monarch says no, then too late, that's it. Whereas European geography has loads of peninsulae, it has loads of mountain ranges, it has some islands as well, it has basically lots of geographical choke points which make it very difficult for one single empire to conquer the whole of Europe. The Roman Empire failed to do this, Napoleon failed to do this, Hitler failed to do this. Obviously geography is the only reason behind all that, but it is most definitely a part of it. It is a component. So in Europe, the geographical situation resulted in lots of different states forming, and as a result, if an explorer was denied by the monarch of one of those states to go on an exploratory voyage, he would just go to another one of those states. And all of these states were in constant competition with each other to explore new lands, develop new technology, etc., etc. Now, I have come to the end of my spiel. I'm going to leave us off there. I feel like we've made good progress there. I actually got through everything that I wanted to talk about, which is amazing and very surprising. There's a gentleman outside who wants to come in for his slot. I'm very wary about taking up his time. But, ladies and gentlemen, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I really hope you've enjoyed. You've learned something as well. I hope you've been sort of engaged and you found this enjoyable. And I'm really, really honoured that you guys would listen to me talk and listen to my show. It's such an honor. It's such a privilege having people listening. I don't actually know if anyone is listening, but if anyone is listening, thank you very much. It really means a lot to me. Anyway, I hope you all have a lovely day and a lovely weekend, and I will see you next week. Take care.